In Mexico, South America, and even in some of the southwestern states of the US, people all around know quite well the tale of the spirit of the woman who is cursed to wander the lakes, rivers, and even roads, searching for her missing children, calling out to them as she weeps. But it's not exactly a sob story. In fact, there is a deep rooted fear in the hearts of many children who grew up listening to the tale of La Llorona. Some continue with that fear throughout their lives, and the decent few even claim to have actually heard and seen the woman and lived to tell the tale. Something that not many who encounter her can claim. Brace yourselves, because I'm about to introduce you to her. Are you ready? Then take my hand, hold it tight, and let's walk into the darkness together. The legend states that there was once an extremely beautiful woman. Her name varies based on which of the many variations you hear, but in ours we will use the most common and call her Maria. Maria had plenty of suitors, all of them entranced with her beauty and hoping they could one day make her their bride. Maria, although extremely flattered by this, never really took any of them seriously until one day when a wealthy Spanish conquistador arrived at her small town. The man took one look at Maria and proclaimed that she was the most beautiful woman that he had ever laid eyes on. Maria, of course, heard this many times before, but never from a man that she had found so attractive. She agreed to marry the conquistador, who set up residence in her town, and soon she had adopted his lifestyle as her own. In time, she bore him two sons who he loved dearly. For many years, Maria lived a very happy life next to her rich, handsome husband and their children. But one day, Maria was unfortunate enough to come across her husband walking around with another very beautiful woman. When she confronted him, her husband proclaimed that Maria was no longer beautiful and that the other woman was now the most beautiful woman that he had ever laid eyes on. Maria was heartbroken. She became enraged with her husband and decided that she would hurt him just as he had hurt her. In her rage, she decided to enact revenge with the thing that he loved the most, his sons. Maria took her boys to a river that was near their estate, and she submerged them into the water, the oldest first, then the younger one, until both children were floating in the water motionless and no longer breathing. Maria took a look at them and what she had done, and her rage transformed immediately into anguish and sorrow. She let out an agonizing cry. "Ay, mis hijos!" She decided then and there to take her own life in the same waters where she had taken her children's. But that didn't end her suffering. For the crime she committed of killing two innocent children, Maria was now cursed. Her spirit now forced to roam aimlessly, a wraith-like figure dressed in white to contrast her long black hair, and searching for her children. When she does find children, she will claim them as hers and take them. In some stories, it's not just children that disappear. Anyone who comes in contact with her will suffer the same fate and never be seen again. Now, due to how far spread and how long the story has been shared from generation to generation, there are some variants. In some, she doesn't commit suicide. Instead, her husband kills her when he realizes what she has done. In others, her long white robe is traded in for a black hooded one. In some stories, she sticks to haunting bodies of waters because that's where she last saw her children, while in others, she roams the streets freely. There is always one constant, however: the agonizing shrieks that she emits as she roams in search of her boys, sometimes even screaming, "Ay, mis hijos!" which translates to "all my children." This is why she was dubbed La Llorona, or, for us English speakers, the Weeping Woman. Many believe that La Llorona was a real woman who they called La Melinche. La Melinche was an indigenous slave who was sold to conquistadors when they first arrived to Mexico. She helped them win the war by acting as a translator and narrator for Hernan Cortes, who later took her as a concubine. This happened in the 1500s. However, some say that the story has mythological ties and that La Llorona story actually derives from Cihuacuatl, an Aztec deity who was linked to motherhood. Nowadays, most people believe that the story is more of a fable that is used simply to warn children of the dangers of roaming the streets alone at night and keeping them away from rivers and lakes. But there are still some who believe, some who claim they have seen. There are many encounter stories that have been printed in newspapers, magazines, and websites with people who claim to have heard or seen La Llorona. People like Reddit user DJ Underdog 85, who posted an experience they had when they were 11 years old in El Paso, Texas. They had been living in a trailer with their parents and their younger brother. On the night that they write about, however, their younger brother had gone to spend the night with their aunt. They say that they fell asleep watching TV on the living room couch as usual. When they woke up in the middle of the night, they looked towards the kitchen where they could see the digital clock on the stove and realized it was 4 a.m. The television had been turned off by someone or something, and although they usually had a light on, they claimed that this time everything was pitch black, and that's when they began to hear it. They describe it as a horrible screaming that was coming from the distance. They explained that they had a ditch that was a few feet away from their trailer, and the scream sounded as if it had come from there. At first, they second-guessed themselves, wondering if they had really heard something, then wondered if they might still be dreaming. But the screams continued, and they even realized that the animals in the area were also hearing it and having a very negative reaction to it. They started to howl and to whimper. They write, as the screaming got closer, the animals continued to cry. The screaming was something I had never experienced before. It sounded like I was in a big hallway, and the woman was screaming her guts out down that hallway. Then, in all the screaming, I started to make out words. These words being said by whoever this was at 4 a.m., screaming their guts out, shocked me. The woman said, "Ay, mis hijos." In a huge panic, I quickly got up from the sofa and ran to the kitchen, right next to where I was asleep. I turned on the closet light and looked around. The screaming didn't stop. In fact, the screaming only got louder and closer. They say they ran to their parents' room as quickly as possible and began to wildly shake their mother awake. And as she slowly did wake, the screaming they had been hearing began to fade. They asked their mother if they could hear the woman who was screaming and crying outside, but their mother, who was still half asleep, told them to go back to sleep and that they were just imagining things. No matter how much they pleaded with their mother and told them it had been real, their mom simply told them that it was a dream and that they should go back to sleep. He did as he was told and went back to the living room, leaving all the lights on along the way and turning on the television. He says that he couldn't fall back to sleep again until the sun came up. That isn't the only person who claims that animals have been very affected by La Llorona, though. A Reddit user, who has since deleted their account, posted his experience stating that La Llorona had marked them for life. They grew up in a small town in Mexico and were still living there at the age of 15 when their maternal grandmother passed away. Their uncles had all agreed that they didn't want to leave their grandfather alone during that time, so they got them to stay at the grandfather's house for a time to keep him company. One night, after a game of soccer with friends that ended particularly late, they took the long walk back home in the dark that crossed a river and a bridge, yet they made it home without any issues. His big white husky, who kept his grandfather company during the day, greeted him happily. They sat down next to their grandfather's bed and watched the news with him as usual, and at around 11 p.m., when the news finished, their grandfather went to bed. Around 20 minutes after this happened, their husky began to get fidgety and restless. They began to bark and squeal. They say that it made them so restless as well because their dog is usually never afraid of anything. Then they began to hear it. They wrote, "We heard a crying, deep, full of pain." Their dog was so affected by it that he ran under the bed and stayed there whimpering. He continues, "It was a cry capable of paralyzing you, of freezing your soul, and every time I was close to the window, I could not move." After about 3 minutes, my dog came out from under the bed to bark. The crying was gone. It's not just older children that she affects either. She has been known to take babies as well, like in the next encounter tale, where another Reddit user, TJ Shuck, we'll just call him TJ from now on, gave us a horrific story of how he saved his small son from La Llorona's grasp. According to the post, he wrote this the next morning after the incident. TJ and his girlfriend had gotten into a heated argument, and he decided to sleep on the couch. He grabbed his pillows and around 9 p.m. he made his makeshift bed on the sofa and fell asleep. He woke up again at 2:30 in the morning, used the restroom, and laid back down on the couch. He began to get this strange feeling as if the house was too quiet and decided to take a look inside the bedroom and make sure that everyone was okay. His girlfriend was fast asleep and his 10-month-old son was in his crib and asleep as well. As he looked at them, he thought it over and decided that he was over the argument. He picked up his pillows and went back to the room, slowly and quietly climbing into the bed to not wake the others. He tells us he lives in Arizona, and at the time there was a cool breeze there, so they left the window open to let it in. He falls asleep and not long after is awoken by his son's loud cries, which was unusual for him, since he tended to be one of those quiet babies that slept through the night without much of a fuss. When he opened his eyes to check on his son, his girlfriend had already gotten up and was at the crib, checking on him. She picked him up and the baby immediately stopped crying and relaxed. When he looked at the time, TJ noticed it was 3 a.m. The baby, although quiet now, seemed to not want to go back to sleep. So his girlfriend lays him down on the bed between them and feeds him a bottle. As she feeds the baby, TJ falls back to sleep. He begins to dream that he's in a bed in the exact same position. It's dark and quiet, except for someone crying and moaning, like someone who was grieving the death of a loved one. He says, "It's a long, drawn-out cry, and it's eerie like the breeze coming through the window." He says that all of a sudden he wakes with a jolt. His eyes are wide open. There's sweat trickling down his forehead. He says, "I can still hear the cry, but this time I know I'm awake, so I know it's real." I spin around fast, and that's when I see her. She's tall, dressed all in black, like she just came from a funeral. Her face distressed, like she's been in mourning for eternity. The wind coming through the window is strong, and the curtain is blowing like a flag. I see her as she reaches for my son, who is lying asleep between me and my girlfriend. So, I did what any father would do. I grabbed the blanket with my left hand and came down with my arm over my son and the blanket covering both of us, and I hold on to him tight. All of a sudden, a sheer scream rings out from what I assume to be the woman, and a gust of wind hits the window hard. Boom! And then quiet. Nothing but my girlfriend snoring, and my son's breathing, and my very heavy breathing. He claims that the heavy breeze that had been blowing the curtain like a flag before was now back to the nice, lazy breeze they had been having earlier. He lay awake for a while, and then fell back to sleep with his arms still protectively draped over his son. When he woke up in the morning and asked his girlfriend if she had heard anything in the night, his girlfriend confirmed that there had been someone crying, but it had sounded to her as if it was coming from outside. At that point, he knew that the strange creature that he had seen in the night had been real. TJ says that he will be keeping a much closer eye on his son from now on. Another Reddit user named La Vida NYC claims that they were born in Central America and that they know that the Llorona is a real thing. They say that they lived in an acre of land that was in front of a soccer field, but that their home was built in a patch of land that used to be a sugarcane plantation field, and they heard lots of crazy things as children. They say they remember that sometimes when a new baby was born in the neighborhood, you could hear La Llorona wailing around midnight, and the next morning you'd wake up to the news that a baby was dead. They say that the crying gives you chills and it's loud and sad as hell. I would try to look outside the window, but you couldn't see a thing. But just hear that darn crying and it just makes it that way more scary. And of course, there are also those stories that get passed down. The ones that happen to our parents and grandparents and are so creepy that we pass them on to our kids. Like our next encounter story posted by Reddit user Della Curls. Yes, I did scour Reddit for this video. Don't judge. Della Curls writes that they had been told this story a few times by their mother, and even now they still get creeped out by it. They state that their mother is from a small town in Mexico located in Zacatecas. At around the age of 14, their mother had the habit of waking her mother up to use the restroom since it was an older style home which had the bathroom outside. Della Curl's mother claims that one day she woke up at around 3 a.m. and needed to use the restroom badly. She began to call out for her mother, but wasn't getting a reply. After a while of this without getting a reply, she began to feel agitated and began to scream for her mother. She turns around and sees that her mother is standing at the foot of her bed, wearing a white robe, but she had a very bleak expression on her face and she had both arms extended. Della Curl's mother said that she suddenly felt extremely cold and a huge sense of dread came over her. Never before had she seen her mother wearing a white robe. She turned her gaze downward and noticed to her horror that her mother's feet weren't touching the floor. She let out a scream and quickly covered her head with a blanket. That's when her mother came into the room wearing something completely different and finds her daughter shaking in her bed. Of course, she was told it was just a dream, and no one that she told the story to took her seriously. But she was vindicated when a few nights later there happened to be a power outage. She, her siblings, and parents all decided to camp out and sleep in the living room together. At around 3 a.m., they all woke up to the wailing and cries of La Llorona coming from down the street. Just like these stories, there are hundreds, maybe even thousands more scattered throughout Latin America and the US, all claiming that they have seen the dreaded Llorona. But is she real or just a fictional story that has been passed down so much that it's now world known thanks to movies and songs based on the tale, but was ever really meant to keep kids safe and away from the water? Well, I'll leave that up to you to decide. As for me, if I ever hear the agonizing cries of a woman who is searching for her children at 3 a.m. coming from anywhere, you can be sure that I'll be going the other way, like far away, that way. That's it for today. Let me know in the comments if you believe in La Llorona and if you've ever encountered her. You can also let me know where you're from if you happen to have found me through a bill. Feel free to check out some of my other videos or help my small channel grow by sharing it with others who love scary stories just like us. And as always, remember to like if you liked and subscribe if you want more. I'll see you next time.